On August 3, 1923, Vice President Calvin Coolidge became the 30th President of the United States upon the sudden death of his predecessor, Warren G. Harding. His father, Colonel John Coolidge, a notary public and justice of the peace, administered the oath of office at 2:47 a.m. in the sitting room of the family home in Plymouth Notch, Vermont. Headlines announced the news the following day, and Americans everywhere wondered, who is Calvin Coolidge? Perhaps his lasting legacy is not his legislative record, but his personal record of leadership with dignity and humility. In his own words, he once observed, "It is a great advantage to a president and a major source of safety to the country for him to know he is not a great man."
The 1919 Boston police strike has had an impact on Bostonians and Americans that has lasted for generations. To appreciate its place in history, it's important to understand the timeline of events that led up to the crisis. By the end of 1918, the Great War was over. The Spanish flu epidemic had run its course, and Massachusetts voters elected Calvin Coolidge as their 48th governor. Let's turn the clock back to 1919 to review the headline stories for that year, as reported in the Boston Herald. 1919 turned out to be a year of growing unrest among American workers, resulting in protests, strikes, and escalating violence. Christmas came to an abrupt end in New England the following day, when baseball fans learned the shocking news that Red Sox sell Babe Ruth to Yanks for more than $100,000. And so began the curse of the Bambino. Years later, during his short-lived retirement, President Calvin Coolidge wrote his autobiography. Looking back on his life, he reflected upon his 2 terms as governor of Massachusetts and the dramatic events of 1919. In his own words, Mr. Coolidge clearly recognized the role that fate had played. No doubt it was the police strike of Boston that brought me into national prominence.
I've often said, if you see 10 troubles coming down the road, you can be sure that 9 of them will run into a ditch before they reach you. The Boston police strike was one of those troubles that kept coming down the road. In preparing my autobiography, I've reflected upon the events that led up to this crisis and considered what, if anything, I might have done differently to have averted it. There are 3 main characters in my version of the 1919 Boston police strike with whom I interacted most closely. The police commissioner, Mr. Edwin U. Curtis, the mayor, Mr. Andrew J. Peters, and the founder and president of the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, Mr. Samuel Gompers. Many have speculated that the Boston police strike would never have happened had it not been for the untimely death of the city's first police commissioner, Mr. Stephen O'Mara. He died of a stroke on December 15th, 1918. During the course of his 12-year career, he earned the respect of his men who, through his leadership, truly became Boston's finest. On December 26, 1918, Mr. Curtis and Boston City Mayor Andrew James Peters met with a delegation from the Boston Social Club, an organization that served as a means for members of the Boston Police Department to voice their concerns. The patrolmen reiterated their 3 long-standing grievances: length of working shifts, working conditions, and most of all, wages. That summer, they had unsuccessfully petitioned for a $200 increase in the patrolman's annual salary, which was then $1,200. This proposed increase was roughly equivalent to the costs for their uniform and equipment, which policemen were required to purchase themselves. Furthermore, patrolmen worked in excess of 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, with just 1 day off in 15. Their final point of contention related to the conditions under which they were required to work, particularly in the crowded decay and disrepair of the police stations. No doubt, their growing dissent was stirred up by the high wages factories and shipyards were now paying for comparatively unskilled labor. Once again, Mayor Peters refused their request, stating the city could not afford such a hike. The trouble arose over the proposal of the policemen, who had long been permitted to maintain a local organization of their own, to form a union and affiliate with the American Federation of Labor. This was contrary to a long-established rule of the department, which was agreed to by each member when he went onto the force and had the effect of law. When the policemen's union persisted in its course, I was urged by a committee appointed by the mayor to interfere and attempt to make Commissioner Curtis settle the dispute by arbitration. The governor appoints the commissioner and probably could remove him, but he has no more jurisdiction over his acts than he has over the judges of the courts. Besides, I did not see how it was possible to arbitrate the question of the authority of the law or the necessity of obedience to the rules of the department and the orders of the commissioner. These principles were the heart of the whole controversy and the only important questions at issue. It can readily be seen how important they were and what effect it might have been had they not been maintained. I decided to support them whatever the consequences might be. I fully expected that it would result in my defeat in the coming campaign for re-election as governor. While I had no direct responsibility for the conduct of police matters in Boston, yet, as the chief executive, it was my general duty to require the laws to be enforced. So, I remained in Boston and kept carefully informed of the conditions. I knew I might be called on to act at any time. When it became perfectly apparent that the policemen's union was acting in violation of the rules of the department, the leaders were brought before the commissioner on charges, tried, and removed from office. Were about 3/4 of the force left the department in a body at about 5 o'clock on the afternoon of Tuesday, September 9th. The number was much larger than had been expected. Around midnight, bands of men appeared on the street who broke many shop windows and carried away quantities of goods which were on display. Many arrests were made, but the remaining police and the reinforcements were not sufficient to prevent the disorder. I knew nothing of this until morning. The strike occurred on Tuesday night. The guard were called on Wednesday, and Thursday I issued a general order restoring Mr. Curtis to his place as commissioner in order to control the police, and made a proclamation calling on all citizens to assist me in preserving order and especially directing all police officers in Boston to obey the orders of Mr. Curtis. This was the important contribution that I made to the tactics of the situation, which has never fully been realized. To Mr. Curtis should go the credit for raising the issue and enforcing the principle that the police should not affiliate with any outside body, whether of wage earners or wage payers, but should remain unattached, impartial officers of the law with sole allegiance to the public. In this, I supported him. Soon, Samuel Gompers began to telegraph me asking for the removal of Mr. Curtis and the reinstatement of the Union policemen. This required me to make a reply in which I stated, among other things, that there is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anytime, anywhere. This phrase caught the attention of the nation. It was beginning to be clear that if voluntary associations were to be permitted to substitute their will for the authority of public officials, the end of our government was at hand. The issue was nothing less than whether the law which the people had made through their duly authorized agencies should be supreme.
To learn more about Calvin Coolidge and the 1919 Boston police strike, 3 books in particular address this subject. A City in Terror by Francis Russell, the autobiography of Calvin Coolidge, and Coolidge, a biography by Amity Schlaze.
In the spring of 2017, Tracy Messer, a living history performer from Peterborough, New Hampshire, made his very first appearance as Calvin Coolidge. Perhaps the question people ask him most often is, why did you choose to become the next 30th President of the United States? He'll answer with a smile, I was born to play this role. Perhaps what Tracy loves most about Mr. Coolidge is his common sense and his sense of humor. To contact Calvin Coolidge living history performer Tracy Messer, visit keepcoolwithcoolidge.net.